This presentation in the Advanced SQL series looks at the Type 1 subquery. You can log into MEC and open up SQL Server Management Studio if you want to follow along with the examples. This presentation assumes that you are very comfortable with the material covered in the SQL Fundamentals series. A subquery typically appears in the where clause or in the having clause, but may also be in the from clause. You'll see examples of subqueries in the from clause in a future lesson. The type 1 subquery is executed one time before the outer query, and the output is a temporary data set that's used by the outer query. So let's take a look at a simple example. We're going to list students working on the AutoShop database project. So our subquery, we're going to find out what team ID is associated with the project AutoShop. And so we get a single row of output, sys.des. We use that in the subquery by constructing our regular select clause from students where, and then we list the common field between the outer query and the inner query. So it's team ID. So we're saying where team ID in, and then doing our select clause, which is the subquery up here. This select clause in some cases could have many IDs listed, and so we're just using the in operator to find a match between the outer student team ID with the inner team ID. And so we get our result. So running that here, I run my subquery and I get my sys.des. I can run my subquery as part of the outer query and get the complete result. One of the nice things about a type 1 subquery is you can test it fully independent of the outer query, so you can check and make sure that it's running correctly before you put it inside an outer query. You can also obviously get the result, the answer, in other ways. There are situations though where the type 1 subquery is definitely needed. So let's take another look at an example, and in this case we're going to show the herb crop type and show what crop varieties have been planted in Sector B of South Seed Zone. So one of the other nice things about the type 1 subquery is that it helps you decompose your problem statement. And so we're going to construct the subquery to list the bay beds from Zone South Seed Sector B. And so we run that query and we get a long list of bay beds in the South Seed Zone Sector B. The way we construct the outer query with the subquery is, again, we would join the tables together where we need to set a criteria for herb crop type, and then also restrict output based on bay bed from the TBL crop planting table, bay bed in, and then listing the bay beds from our subquery, and we get that result. So I can run independently what will eventually be my subquery. I can run a separate query just for the outer query if I want to test it independently also. And then I can combine the two of them into a main outer query and a subquery. And I narrow it down to my 8 records. We can use a type 1 subquery instead of using distinct. If we want to list students who did evaluations about their teammates, we can do so, but we'll get the same student as many times as they've done evaluations unless we add the word distinct. That cuts our output from 24 to 12. I can do the same thing with a type 1 subquery, and in many instances this is more efficient in terms of processing time for query. So I created a list of evaluator IDs, and then the outer query does a match on student ID in evaluator ID, and I get my output. If you want to delete records from a table based on criteria in another table, you must use a type 1 subquery. So as an example here that we won't be able to execute, let's say we wanted to see students who have not completed an evaluation, and we see that we have 3. If we wanted to run a delete query, this is how we would structure it. Delete from students where student ID not in, and comparing against the list of evaluator IDs. However, because of our evaluatee foreign key constraint, we would not actually be able to execute this delete statement right now. Let's look at an example of a type 1 subquery in the having clause. Let's find out who got an average evaluation score higher than the class average. First, let's find out what the class average is. This would be our subquery. And we run that query and we get 86. Then we take that subquery, add it to an outer query that calculates the average score for each student. And in the having clause, we're saying where their average score is greater than the subquery value of 86. And we see our output. So I'll run the subquery and get the class average of 86. I'll do a test of the outer query without the subquery, sorting by average score in descending order. And I see Comp and Oliver will be the bottom of that list. And then I run the outer query with the subquery, and I see those same 7 with Oliver and Comp also being listed. So what we've covered in this presentation is the type 1 subquery. We've used it in the where clause. We looked at using in and not in, acting as a join between the outer query and the subquery. The inner query does not reference the outer query, so it can be tested independently. It creates a temporary data set used by the outer query. No data should be displayed from the subquery in the outer query results. We looked at deleting data using the type 1 query and how to use a type 1 subquery in the having clause.